I'm here. You're safe now.
It hurts so much.
I know. I've got you.
She thought she was invisible. 12:03 in the morning. The master suite at the top of the Ross estate was the kind of room that absorbed sound, the heavy drapes, the charcoal silk, the oak paneling dark as mahogany and twice as old. Sharon Fernandez sat on the edge of the bed that probably cost more than her sister's yearly rent, and she pressed a torn piece of her own cardigan against the wound on her cheekbone, and she did not make a sound. She was good at that. Silence under observation. She had learned it on 100 runways, under 1,000 lenses, in front of crowds who thought they owned her image. She knew how to become still, how to make herself into a surface that reflected light without revealing depth. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be gone, down the east corridor, out the service entrance, and into the first car she could find. But her legs had stopped cooperating somewhere around the second landing, and the master wing had been closer than the exit, and the child was safe in the vault, and she had allowed herself, just for 60 seconds, just 60, to sit down. She thought the house was empty. The household staff had scattered when the breach alarm sounded. Security was sweeping the north wing. The comms traffic she'd monitored from Daniel Ross's own study suggested every available man was 3 floors down, clearing room by room through 162 of them. She had 60 seconds. That was her mistake. Not the wound, not the torn dress or the blood drying at her temple, or the fact that she'd left fingerprints on a letter opener she'd used as a weapon in the east corridor. The mistake was simpler than all of that. She forgot who came home to this room. The door didn't open loudly. It didn't need to. It swung on precision hinges with a low, weighted exhale, the sound of a room being reclaimed. And then the latch caught behind him with a single, deliberate click that landed in the silence like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't known was being written. Sharon didn't move. She heard the stillness change. The quality of the air in the room shifted the way it does when something large and certain enters it. 1 step. 2. Not rushed, not startled. The soft impact of leather on the Aubusson rug, moving with the measured, unhurried economy of a man who had never needed to run toward anything in his life, because everything eventually came to him. The footsteps stopped. She could feel him. The heat of him, the gravitational certainty of him, standing just behind her left shoulder, close enough that the jasmine in her hair would reach him, far enough that she'd have to turn to confirm what every nerve ending in her body was already reporting. She didn't turn. His voice arrived before he moved, low, calm, the vocal equivalent of a locked door. "Who hurt you?" Sharon's fingers tightened on the torn fabric against her cheek. Her jaw set. She had faced editors who made grown men cry, photographers who used silence as a scalpel, a room full of men tonight who had meant to kill her. She did not flinch. But something about the way he said it, not a question exactly, more like a charge being filed, made her breath come shorter. He moved then. Not away, around. His footsteps tracked a slow, deliberate arc until he was standing in front of her, so blocking the lamp, and Sharon Fernandez, who had graced the cover of Vogue in 14 countries, who had been called the most looked-at woman alive, finally looked up. Daniel Ross was not what she had expected from his reputation. She had expected boardroom cold, the polished menace of a man who operated through intermediaries and lawyers. What she got was something more elemental. He was still in his dress shirt, cuffs loose, collar open, and the tattoos that disappeared beneath the white linen made him look like a man who had only partially agreed to be civilized. His jaw was set. His rings, heavy gold, the kind you wore when you wanted a handshake to be remembered, caught the lamplight. His eyes moved across her face with a focus she recognized. The way a person looks at something they've decided matters. He did not call for a medic. He did not reach for his phone. He reached for her jaw, 2 fingers, careful, tilting her face toward the light. Cold metal against her skin. His thumb ghosted across the cut at her temple without touching it, a proximity that was somehow worse than contact. "A nanny," he said, and the word in his mouth sounded like a door being opened to examine what was behind it. "Doesn't move through a firefight like that, and she doesn't hold a man's gaze the way you're holding mine right now." He lowered himself to one knee in front of her, bringing them eye level, and the casual ease of it, a king kneeling not in deference but in order to be closer, made the room feel suddenly, irreversibly small. "Try again," he said, "and understand that I already know more than you think I do. I'm giving you the chance to tell me the rest yourself." Sharon held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then, very quietly, she said, "Your son is safe." Daniel Ross went still. And in the stillness, something shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked less like relief and more like recognition. Like a man who had been searching a very long time for something and had just identified where it had been hiding. He didn't move back. "I know," he said. "He's been safe for 20 minutes. I've been looking for you." He didn't ask twice. That was the first thing she learned about Daniel Ross. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he already understands that time is a resource he controls, and you do not. And then he crossed to the ensuite bathroom with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, and returned with a Hermes hand towel, a crystal tumbler of water, and a small leather case she recognized as a Mont Blanc travel kit, the kind that cost more than most people's rent and came monogrammed. His initials caught the low light. DR. Of course they did. He set everything on the nightstand with quiet precision, pulled the velvet ottoman from the base of the bed, and sat directly in front of her. Close. Close enough that his knees were a breath from hers. Close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw that no photographer had ever managed to catch. Close enough that retreating into the silk behind her would have looked like exactly what it was. She didn't retreat. "There were 12 of them," he said. Not a question. A calibration. He was telling her what he already knew to measure the distance between her version and the truth. They came in through the East Service Corridor at approximately 11:40, disabled 2 of my men, moved toward the North Wing nursery with, he paused, opening the leather case with methodical fingers, professional efficiency. He looked up, which means someone paid for them. Someone with access to my floor plans. His eyes held hers. "You're going to tell me who?" Sharon said nothing. He didn't react. He lifted a cotton compress from the kit, poured a careful measure of water from the tumbler, and reached for her face with the same 2-fingered deliberateness from before. She let him. She wasn't sure why she let him. Survival calculus, perhaps, or the quieter, less defensible fact that his hands were startlingly careful for hands that wore that much gold. The compress touched the cut at her temple and she kept her breath even. "The boy." She said it before she decided to. "I need to know he's still. Leo is with my head of security." The name landed between them with a softness that didn't match the rest of him. "He's asleep." He asked for his rabbit. A beat. The stuffed one, not a real one, before your imagination runs away with you. The corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. Daniel Ross noticed. He noticed the way men notice things they've been quietly cataloging for longer than is strictly professional. He turned the compress over, pressed the cooler side against her cheekbone, and said very quietly, "The East Corridor. You were the one who engaged them on the East Corridor." It wasn't a question either. "Your security feed," she said. "My security feed." He confirmed it without apology. "You moved through them like someone who had been trained to move through them, Not panicked, purposeful. He tilted her chin slightly, that gold ring cold and precise against her jaw, and examined the wound with the focused attention of a man who found the details of her more interesting than the crisis surrounding her. You were protecting the exit route to the vault, yes? You knew where the vault was. A pause. Your sister's briefing notes were thorough. He absorbed this. He set the compress down and retrieved an antiseptic wipe from the kit. Clé de peau, she noticed, and the kind that came in the expensive amenity sets, and the smell of it rose between them, clean and sharp. My sister, he said, briefs household staff on emergency exits, not on vault codes, not on security rotation schedules. He met her eyes. How did you know the rotation had changed at 11:30? She said nothing. You listened to the comms. He said it without heat, almost with something that resembled appreciation, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. In my study, which means you were in my study before the breach. He smoothed a thin adhesive strip across her temple, his thumb trailing the edge of it with a care that felt less clinical with every passing second. Which means you moved through this house with a very specific kind of confidence for a woman who was supposed to be reading bedtime stories. The room held its breath. Daniel sat back, not far, never far, and rested his forearms on his knees, his rings catching the amber light from the Tiffany lamp on the nightstand, and he looked at her the way he had when she'd first met his eyes. Like something being identified, like something being decided. You're not going to tell me tonight, he said. No. He nodded, slowly, as though she'd confirmed something he'd already made peace with. Then he stood, crossed to the door, not to open it but to ensure the lock was still engaged, and turned back to face her from across the room. Then we have time, he said simply. I have 162 rooms to clear. You're staying in this one. The comms unit was a discreet thing. Matte black, no larger than a cigarette case, the kind of equipment that didn't come from a catalog. It sat on the writing desk beside a Mont Blanc pen set and a decanter of what she was fairly certain was a single malt old enough to vote, and when it crackled to life for the first time, Sharon understood that the room had been listening to the house this entire time. Daniel crossed to it without urgency. He lifted it with 2 fingers, pressed the channel open and said nothing, just listened, and something in the quality of his listening made the air tighten. Are you still listening? Kindly smash that subscribe button so you do not miss the next story. I really appreciate your support for my videos, thank you. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. 3 men cleared from the Aubusson gallery. 2 more located in the wine cellar, subdued, restrained, currently zip-tied to a rack of 1996 Petrus that Daniel would no doubt invoice someone for. The east corridor was secured, the west drawing room still pending. He responded in 4 words, the channel closed. Sharon watched him set the unit back on the desk with the careful placement of a man who put everything exactly where it belonged. And she thought, this is what power actually looks like. Not the raised voice, not the dramatic gesture, the 4-word response, the certainty that it would be enough. She had spent a decade photographed beside powerful men, oligarchs at Cannes, tech architects in Singapore, a prime minister's son in a palazzo outside Florence who had mistaken proximity for intimacy. She had learned to identify the performance of power from its distance. What she was watching now was not a performance. She stood. It was a practical decision. Her left leg had stiffened on the silk, and remaining on the bed while he moved freely around the room was a psychological disadvantage she was no longer willing to concede. She pushed off the mattress and crossed toward the window, where the grounds below were a dark geometry of manicured hedges and gravel paths, punctuated at intervals by the sweeping beams of flashlights moving through the garden with coordinated precision. She counted the lights without thinking. 7 teams. Exterior perimeter still active. "You're limping." She hadn't heard him move. He was closer than she'd calculated. 3 feet, maybe less, standing just behind her right shoulder with his forearms loose at his sides, watching the grounds the way she had been watching them. A mirror of her posture. Deliberate, she suspected. "I'm fine," she said. "You're compensating on the left side." A pause. "You have been since the East Corridor, but you're managing it well. Someone taught you to manage it well." His eyes moved from the window to her profile. Most people, when they're hurt and trying to hide it, go flat. They shrink. Their whole body apologizes. He let that sit for a moment. "You don't do that. You redistribute, you lengthen." His head tilted just slightly. "Where did you learn to move like that?" She kept her eyes on the garden. "Yoga," she said. He said nothing. The silence had a texture by now. She was learning to read it. This one was the variety that meant we both know that's not true, and I'm content to let you keep saying it. The comms crackled again. Rooms 40 through 61. Clear. The North Library secured. One operative located behind the concealed door behind the Basquiat. She filed that detail away without expression, because a man who kept a Basquiat behind a concealed door was a man whose house had layers she hadn't fully mapped. 2 more mercenaries in the secondary garage attempting to access the vehicle bay. His men had reached them first. Daniel pressed the channel. 6 words this time. The channel closed. Sharon turned from the window, intending to return to the ottoman, a tactical repositioning, nothing more, and her left knee registered its objection halfway through the pivot. She corrected. Immediately, automatically, and the way her body had been trained to correct on a runway when a heel caught a cobblestone in Milan, or the hem of a Valentino gown snagged a stage edge in New York. Chin level, shoulders back. The weight transferred before the stumble could complete itself. She looked up to find Daniel Ross watching her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Not admiration, she had a surplus of that, and it had long since stopped registering. This was something more precise. Recognition. "Yoga," he said again, softly, and the word in his mouth now was not a challenge. It was a placeholder, a slot he was reserving for the correct answer, which he clearly believed he was already close to finding. He moved to the writing desk and opened the shallow center drawer. From it, he produced a remote, slim as a credit card, pressed a single button, and the wall panel beside the fireplace exhaled softly and slid aside to reveal a concealed corridor, dark and narrow, lined in a pale Venetian plaster that reflected the firelight in warm amber ribbons. He looked back at her. 40 rooms left, he said. "We're not staying here while they clear them." He extended his hand, not a suggestion, not quite a command, something in the precise territory between the two. "Stay close, and try not to correct your gait. It tells me more than you want it to." The corridor was narrower than it looked from the doorway. Sharon understood this approximately 4 steps in, when the Venetian plaster walls closed to roughly the width of a door frame, and the ambient light from the fireplace behind them became a memory. Daniel had produced a slim torch, brushed titanium, and the kind that came in a Porsche design travel set, and threw a beam so precise it felt almost surgical, and he held it low, illuminating the floor rather than the walls, which she suspected was a deliberate choice. Less disorientation, controlled visibility. He managed even darkness with intention. She followed him without speaking. The passage ran parallel to the main hallway for perhaps 30 feet before it turned, and then turned again, and she lost her orientation entirely, which she imagined was also by design. A house with 162 rooms did not develop hidden corridors by accident. It developed them because someone had planned very carefully for nights like this one. The elevator announced itself not with a door, but with a seam, a hairline interruption in the plaster that Daniel's fingers found without the torch, from memory, pressing a recessed panel that yielded with a soft magnetic release. The door slid aside. The interior light came on automatically, warm, low, the amber of a good hotel at midnight. It was, she estimated, 4 feet by 4 feet, possibly less. Daniel stepped in and turned, and the geometry of the situation presented itself to her with quiet, absolute clarity. She stepped in after him because there was no alternative that didn't involve going back through 40 feet of dark corridor alone, and the door slid shut behind her with a sound like a held breath finally released. He pressed the single unmarked button on the brass panel. The elevator began to descend. Neither of them spoke. There was practically nowhere to look that wasn't him. He had turned to face the door out of some consideration for her comfort, which meant she was looking at the back of his shoulder, the slope of it beneath the white linen, the place where the shirt had come slightly untucked on the left side during whatever had happened before he'd arrived in the master suite. The tattoos at his wrist emerged below the rolled cuff. Something geometric, deliberate, the kind of ink that told a story in a language she didn't yet speak. Then she noticed the scent. She had been aware of it peripherally since the bedroom, cataloged and filed the way the brain files background information, present but unprocessed, because there had been more urgent things to process. Here, in 4 feet of closed air, it arrived fully. Something dark and unhurried, sandalwood at the base with something cooler above it, the ghost of cedar and, she was almost certain, a note of black amber that she recognized from a Creed fragrance she had been photographed advertising 3 seasons ago. She knew that scent with the intimacy of someone who had stood under studio lights wearing it on borrowed skin for 6 hours in a Paris afternoon. On him, it was entirely different. On him, it was not a fragrance. It was a fact. Sharon fixed her gaze on the brass panel and made the conscious, effortful decision to breathe through her mouth, which helped approximately not at all. And then the elevator shifted. A minor mechanical hiccup. Nothing more, the cable finding its rhythm, and the movement closed the remaining distance between them in a way that physics rather than intention had arranged. His arm was against hers, the sleeve of his shirt against the torn yellow fabric of her cardigan. The warmth of him coming through both layers with a directness that made the temperature of the small space feel rearranged. He didn't move away. Neither did she. "This elevator," she said, because silence was no longer a resource she could afford, "was not in your sister's briefing notes." "No," he said, "it wasn't." A pause. Neither was the passage behind the Sevres cabinet on the 3rd floor, the staircase inside the east chimney stack, or the tunnel that runs from the wine cellar to the groundskeeper's cottage. He glanced at her sideways. Just barely, just enough. The house has a second architecture. Most people who work here never learn it. Another pause, more deliberate than the first. "I find myself wondering how far you would have gotten on your own." "Far enough," she said. "Possibly." He looked forward again. "You have very good instincts for a woman who arranges nap schedules." The elevator stopped. The door slid open onto a low-ceilinged antechamber, stone-floored, lined with shelving that held a collection of Bernardo porcelain and 3 cases of Krug in careful rows. The humidity precisely controlled. The temperature a cool 60 degrees that hit her warm skin like a soft collision. She stepped out, put 2 feet of stone between them and breathed, properly, fully, for the first time in 4 floors. Daniel stepped out behind her and she heard the quiet sound of him straightening his cuff, settling back into himself, and when she turned he was watching her with that expression again, the precise one. The one that reserved space for an answer he hadn't received yet. "Your composure," he said quietly, "is exceptional." His eyes moved across her face with that same focused attention he'd brought to cleaning her wound, the same quality of looking that made her feel simultaneously seen and studied. But it slipped, just slightly, twice. He tilted his head. "I'd very much like to know why." Sharon held his gaze and said nothing, and somewhere above them, through the stone and the silence, the comms on the desk they'd left behind crackled with the voices of men clearing rooms she was no longer in. The library was 2 floors above the wine cellar and accessible, she was learning, through a passage that existed in the space between the house's public face and its private one. A gap in the architecture that ran like a secret sentence through the middle of an otherwise legible text. Daniel moved through it without hesitation, one hand trailing the wall at intervals. Not for balance, but for orientation, the way a man moves through a space he has navigated so many times it has become instinct rather than memory. The door at the end opened behind a section of shelving that swung outward on a counterweighted hinge, and the library received them in silence. It was the kind of room that made other rooms feel provisional. 2 stories of walnut shelving rose to a coffered ceiling, each shelf fitted with a slim brass rail and a running light that threw the spines into warm relief. A Steinway Grand sat in the far corner, black lacquer, lid closed, beside a reading chair in oxblood leather that had the particular worn quality of something used rather than displayed. The desk at the center was partner's style, wide as a dining table, with a green Tiffany lamp at each end, casting overlapping pools of sage and amber. A Lalique paperweight caught the light from the nearest lamp and scattered it across the ceiling in pale, fractured arcs. Daniel crossed to the desk and pressed a button beneath the lip of it. The shelving door swung closed behind them. He lifted a secondary comms unit from the drawer. He had, she was noticing, prepared this house the way a chess player prepares a board, and listened to the abbreviated report from the men above without expression, responded in his characteristic economy of words, and set it down. Then he turned to face the room. She was already at the shelves. It was reflex, the same way some people reach for their phone in an unfamiliar room, and she reached for what was on the walls. Books first. She registered their arrangement as she passed, alphabetical by author within subject, the spines a mix of English, Italian, and what she was fairly certain was Mandarin. And then, at the end of the lower shelf nearest the window, a different category entirely. Periodicals bound and filed in chronological order, The Economist, Architectural Digest, several volumes of departures, and there, filed precisely between a November and a January, its cover slightly outward as though it had been replaced in haste or examined recently, Vogue Paris. September issue, 14 months ago. She saw it the same moment he did. She knew the cover without looking at it directly. She had stood in that studio for 6 hours. She had worn a gown that weighed 11 pounds, structured ivory silk with a Schiaparelli bodice, her hair pulled back to something between severity and grace, her eyes directed at a lens she had learned to treat like a mirror rather than a window. The cover line read, in both French and English, "The most looked at woman in the world." Daniel crossed the room with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, lifted the magazine from the shelf and held it open between them. His eyes moved from the cover to her face with the methodical patience of a man completing a comparison he had begun some time ago and was only now arriving at its conclusion. She didn't look away. He studied her for a long moment. The torn cardigan, the adhesive strip at her temple, the dried stain along her collarbone, the particular way she was standing, shoulders level, chin at the precise angle that a decade of cameras had made habitual, even in a crisis, even in a library at midnight with blood on her dress and someone else's mercenaries in the floors above her. He closed the magazine, set it on the desk with the same care he brought to every object he touched. "You're a long way from Paris, Sharon." Her name in his mouth was a different thing than it had been in other mouths. Quieter, more certain, as though he were not introducing it but returning it to her, having kept it for long enough. She let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then, "How long have you known?" "The walk," he said simply. "Well, in the East Corridor footage. Before the wound, before the vault, before any of it." He moved to the oxblood chair and sat, forearms on his knees, the magazine between them on the desk like evidence at a quiet trial. "I've seen that walk on 4 continents. I recognized it before I recognized your face." A pause. The face took another 20 minutes. The lighting in the East Corridor's poor. She almost laughed. She caught it, but only just. "You could have said something," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I found I didn't want to." He looked at her steadily. "You were choosing not to tell me. I was curious what else you would choose." The Lalique paperweight scattered its pale light across the ceiling between them. Somewhere above, the comms murmured with the progress of men through rooms she had already survived, and Sharon Fernandez stood in a library that cost more than most buildings, and understood, with a clarity that felt like stepping off a runway into cold air, that the most dangerous thing in this house was no longer the 12 men with weapons. It was the one sitting in the oxblood chair, watching her with the quiet, absolute patience of a man who had already decided he had all night. She told him the truth the way she did most difficult things, without preamble, without softening, standing in the center of the library with her hands at her sides and her chin level, because she had learned long ago that the posture of honesty mattered as much as its content. Her sister's name was Delilah. Younger by 4 years, quieter by a lifetime. The kind of woman who moved through the world in the margins of other people's certainties and had, for 8 months, been Leo's nanny at the Ross estate with a dedication that had apparently impressed everyone except the stomach virus that had flattened her completely at 6:30 that evening. Delilah had called her from the floor of her apartment bathroom, voice barely above a whisper, terrified not of her own misery, but of a single, practical consequence, that she would lose the position, that the agency would replace her, that 8 months of trust built with a small boy who had taken 12 weeks to stop crying when she left the room would dissolve overnight because she had the misfortune of being human. So, Sharon had come. She had pulled her hair back, borrowed Delilah's spare uniform, the yellow cardigan 2 sizes too warm for the season, the white dress her sister wore with a quiet pride Sharon found standing in it, unexpectedly moving. And she had arrived at the service entrance at 7:45 with a cover story thin as tissue paper and the absolute conviction that one night was manageable. She stopped there. Let the shape of it settle in the library air. Daniel had not moved from the oxblood chair. He had listened the way he did everything, with a quality of attention that made other people's listening feel approximate by comparison, his forearms resting on his knees, his rings catching the Tiffany lamplight, his eyes on her face throughout with an expression she couldn't fully read and had stopped trying to. "The agency doesn't know," she said. "No one does. Delilah would lose her position if they found out she'd sent a substitute, so," she paused, "I would appreciate your discretion." "You came here," Daniel said, and his voice was very quiet, "to protect your sister's livelihood. You stayed." He paused, and she heard him recalibrating, absorbing, when 12 armed men entered the house, and instead of leaving through any one of the 6 viable exit points you clearly identified, you went toward my son. She said nothing, because it hadn't been a question. He stood, not abruptly. Nothing he did was abrupt, but with a kind of deliberateness that changed the quality of the room, the way weather changes the quality of air before it arrives. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment, looking out at the grounds where his men's flashlight beams were fewer now, the sweep of them slower, the house giving up its intruders one by one. When he turned, something in his expression had shifted. The precise, assessing quality was still there. She suspected it was structural, built into him at a level that predated anything she could affect. But beneath it, something else had surfaced. Something less guarded and considerably more unsettling. "He's not an easy child to reach," Daniel said. "Leo, he has his mother's instinct for self-containment." A pause that carried significant weight. It took his last nanny 6 months to get him to eat at the table rather than alone in his room. Delilah managed it in 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. He would have been terrified tonight, with anyone else. He was brave, Sharon said, and meant it without qualification. He asked once if you were coming. Once. And then he helped me secure the vault door from the inside and told me the combination without being asked, because he said you had taught him that information is a resource, and resources should be shared with allies. She paused. He's 7. Something moved across Daniel Ross's face that she thought she would spend considerable time thinking about later. It arrived and was controlled and managed within the space of 2 seconds, but she had spent a career reading what people did with their faces under pressure, and she had seen it clearly, the crack in the composed surface, the unguarded flare of a feeling so large it briefly exceeded his capacity to contain it. He crossed the room, not to the desk, not to the comms unit, to her. He stopped close, that precise, calculated distance he always chose, and the one that was near enough to be undeniable and far enough to be, technically, deniable. And he looked at her with an openness that felt almost out of character, as though the armor had developed a specific, Sharon-shaped gap. "You could have left," he said. "Yes. You had the skills, the access, and every practical reason to leave." His eyes moved across her face with a slow, thorough attention that had nothing clinical about it anymore. "You stayed for a child you had known for approximately 4 hours. Delilah loves him," Sharon said simply. That was enough. He was quiet for a long moment. One hand rose, and she held her breath. But he only reached past her, adjusting the Lalique paperweight on the desk's edge with a small, precise movement that was almost certainly unnecessary and almost certainly not about the paperweight at all. "No," he said softly, and his voice had dropped to that low register that did unreasonable things to the silence around it. "It wasn't Delilah's love that kept you in this house." His eyes came back to hers and stayed. "It was yours." The Tiffany lamps held their quiet pools of light. The Steinway in the corner said nothing. And Sharon Fernandez, who had stood composed and untouchable on the covers of 14 international editions, felt the precise, specific sensation of being seen past every surface she had ever cultivated, and found, in the seeing, not exposed, but somehow terrifyingly recognized. The comms unit on the desk spoke first. The voice on the other end was controlled but abbreviated, the particular compression of professional language under pressure, and Daniel was across the room before the transmission finished, his hand closing around the device with a grip that was the first unguarded physical thing she had seen from him. She didn't need to hear the full report. She read it in the set of his shoulders, the slight recalibration of his posture, the way his eyes moved to the library's concealed entrance and then, immediately, to her. "They've changed floors," he said. Not a question. Not quite an announcement. Simply the truth. delivered without decoration. 2 of them. They separated from the main group somewhere between the 43rd and 44th rooms and came up through the service stairs. His eyes stayed on hers. They're on this level. The library, which had felt like sanctuary 20 minutes ago, rearranged itself in her perception immediately and completely. The 2-story shelving became cover and obstacle in equal measure. The Steinway a liability, the reading lamps a source of light that worked against them. She moved to the nearest switch without being asked. The Tiffany lamps went dark. The Lalique paperweight lost its scattered light. What remained was the pale, ambient silver coming through the high windows, thin and practical, enough to navigate by and nothing more. Daniel was already at the partner's desk. The lower drawer on the right side opened with a biometric yield. She caught the brief green confirmation light, and he straightened with 2 objects in his hands. One was a compact Pelican case, matte black, and the kind designed to survive pressure changes and impact. The other was a firearm, already checked with the quiet, efficient movement of someone for whom that particular sequence was reflexive rather than considered. He crossed to her, held it out. She took it the way she took it, without hesitation, without performance, checking the chamber and the safety in the same breath with the same economy he had just demonstrated. She felt, rather than saw him process this. Another piece of her, filed and reconsidered. "If they get past me," he said, and his voice was very low, a frequency that seemed to exist exclusively for her. "Don't miss." "I haven't yet," she said. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. He opened the Pelican case on the desk and retrieved an earpiece, fitted it, and clipped the comms unit to the interior of his jacket with the practiced ease of a man who had dressed for this kind of evening before, however many years and however many rooms ago that had been. He shrugged his jacket straight, and in the thin silver light of the library he looked, she thought, entirely at home in the particular way that dangerous men look at home in dangerous moments, not comfortable, but correct. As though this was the context in which he was most fully himself. He moved toward the shelving door that led back to the passage, and then he stopped. She wasn't certain, later, whether she could fully account for the sequence of it. He turned back. 2 strides closed the distance between them to nothing, and his left hand rose and found her jaw with the same 2-fingered deliberateness he had used in the master suite. Gold rings, cool against her skin. The press of them familiar now in a way that 4 hours had no right to produce. And he tilted her face upward, and he pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a gentle thing, it was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that makes a declaration, slow and certain, the warmth of it spreading from that single point of contact through the rest of her with an authority that no gesture that small had any reasonable right to carry. His thumb traced the line of her jaw as he drew back, just slightly, and she felt the cold edge of one ring and the warm press of his skin in the same breath, and neither of them moved for 2 full seconds. "Stay behind the Steinway," he said, his voice rougher than it had been. "Sight line to both doors. If the shelving moves, it's me. If the window moves, it isn't." She nodded, managed it steadily. He looked at her for one moment longer than necessary, one moment that had nothing tactical in it whatsoever. And then the shelving door swung outward and he was in the passage and it closed behind him, and the library returned to its silver silence. Sharon moved to the Steinway, set her back against its lacquered flank, faced the room, and raised the firearm to a low, ready position she had not needed in 4 years, and had apparently not forgotten. Her forehead still held the warmth of his mouth like a brand, like a promise, like a question that had been asked in the only language he had apparently decided to use. She kept her eyes on both doors, and she did not miss, and she did not move, and she did not allow herself to think about anything except the next 60 seconds. She was almost successful. The shelving door did not move. The window did. She had approximately 2 seconds between the sound of the latch giving way and the first figure coming through, enough time to confirm the sightline, enough time to register that it was not Daniel, and enough time to make the decision that relocated the evening from the library into something considerably less contained. She fired once. The figure dropped behind the window ledge. The second one, already through and moving left along the shelving wall, changed course the moment the sound hit the room and came toward her instead, which was tactically aggressive and personally her problem. And she put the Steinway between them and moved right because the desk was 12 feet away, and the desk had a biometric drawer, and she had watched Daniel open it, and she had an excellent memory for sequences she might need later. She didn't reach the desk. The shelving door came open. Her peripheral registered it as she was tracking the figure along the wall, and Daniel was through it in a single motion, taking in the room with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of someone whose eyes had been trained to arrive at conclusions before other people finished forming questions. He saw her. He saw the figure. He moved. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed precision of the kind of action she had watched from sets and sound stages, where violence was lit and blocked and given time to breathe. It was fast and functional and entirely without waste. Daniel closed the distance to the first figure with 3 strides and handled the encounter with the brutal, efficient economy of someone who had learned this particular language in a context where sentences needed to be short. 2 exchanges. A Christofle decanter from the sideboard she hadn't noticed became briefly instrumental. The figure went down against the Aubusson rug and did not get up. The second one came off the wall. It came from Daniel's right side, low and fast, the angle designed to compromise his footing, and it would have, she was close enough to see that it would have, except that Sharon had already recalculated the geometry from behind the Steinway, and the decision required no deliberation whatsoever. She moved out from cover, acquired the angle, and fired. Once. Clean. The figure dropped. The library went silent in the specific ringing way that rooms go silent after a firearm discharges in them, a silence that is less the absence of sound and more the presence of its aftermath. Daniel straightened. He stood for a moment with his back to her, breathing, just breathing, and then he turned, and his eyes found her across the 12 feet of Aubusson and silver light between them. And he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the precise assessing look, not the guarded warmth that had surfaced in the library, not the focused attention he brought to cleaning her wound, or reading her walk, or identifying her face from a magazine cover. This was something raw, something that had not been through the same careful editorial process as everything else he had shown her tonight. He crossed to her. His jacket was disheveled, collar open further than before, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that had not been there when he'd left the library, shallow, already deciding to clot, but present, and she filed the information that he was not in fact untouchable alongside everything else she was accumulating about him. He stopped in front of her and his hand came up to her face again, not her jaw this time but her temple, his thumb near the adhesive strip, checking, just checking, not speaking, his eyes moving across her features with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with wounds. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm checking anyway." She let him. She was, she realized, making a habit of letting him, and that realization arrived with the particular quality of information that changes the weather of a room internally while the external temperature holds perfectly steady. His hand dropped. He looked at the 2 figures on the Aubusson with an expression of complete, settled calm, and then he lifted the comms unit from inside his jacket and spoke 4 words that would, she understood, result in several people arriving shortly to manage the consequences of the last 8 minutes. Then he looked back at her, and the rawness had not entirely retreated. Some of it had stayed, lodged at the edges of his composure like light under a door, and he made no visible effort to remove it. "You could have stayed behind the Steinway," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The sight line from there would have been adequate." "It would have been," she said. "From there, I had a shot at his knee. From where I moved to, I had a better one." A pause, long enough to contain several things neither of them were saying. "You moved to protect me," he said, quietly, without inflection, in the way that people state things they are still in the process of absorbing. Sharon held his gaze and neither confirmed nor deflected, because they both already knew, and the library's silver silence held that knowledge between them with a steadiness that felt, improbably, like the steadiest thing that had happened all evening. 14 rooms, Daniel said finally, his voice lower than it needed to be for the information. Then the vault. His eyes stayed on hers. "Then we're finished with this." She understood that this was doing significant work in that sentence, that it contained the mercenaries and the lockdown and the 162-room hunt, and that it conspicuously did not contain everything else. 14 rooms, she said. "Let's go." The vault door was 3 inches of reinforced steel behind a panel of hand-painted de Gournay wallpaper, silk-hung cranes and flowering branches that had concealed it so effectively that 2 of the mercenaries had apparently spent 20 minutes searching the nursery anteroom without finding the seam. She knew this because the comms had reported it 40 minutes ago, and she had filed it under the category of small mercies that had accumulated through the night like quiet interest on a debt she hadn't known she was accruing. Daniel pressed his palm to the biometric reader hidden inside the wainscoting. The mechanism disengaged with a sound like a held breath releasing, and the door swung outward on hinges that moved with a silence that expensive engineering and regular maintenance produced between them, and the light inside the vault was warm and low, and a small boy was asleep on a Loro Piana blanket in the corner, with his stuffed rabbit tucked under his chin and his shoes still on. Sharon stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel went very still beside her. Leo slept with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old who had decided, at some point in the preceding hours, that he had done everything required of him, and the rest was someone else's problem. His chest rose and fell. His rabbit, a battered velveteen thing, clearly of significant personal value and approximately 0 commercial worth, beloved past the point of physical coherence, was gripped at the ear with the certainty that sleep had not loosened. Daniel crossed to him. He lowered himself in that way he had, one knee on the Loro Piana, and he looked at his son for a long, unguarded moment that Sharon understood was not for her to witness, and watched anyway because she could not have looked away from it. He touched the boy's hair once, lightly, with the back of 2 fingers. The rings removed from that hand at some point she hadn't noticed, pocketed, because he had known he was coming here and he had prepared even for this. Then he straightened, and when he turned his face was composed again, but the composure sat differently now, softer at the load-bearing points. He looked at her across the small, warm space of the vault, and something that had been building through 8 chapters of a night that had no reasonable right to have happened, through silk sheets and secret corridors and a 4-foot elevator and a library gone silver and dark, and an Aubusson rug and a forehead kiss that had rearranged the atmospheric pressure of every room she'd entered since, arrived without announcement and without the decency to be gradual. "You should have left," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had an edge she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something more internal than anger, something that sounded like a man confronting an argument he had been making to himself for hours and losing. Every exit was viable by 9 o'clock. You had the skills, the knowledge, and every rational reason to be 3 miles from this house before the first team breached the East Corridor. You've said that, she said. I'm saying it again. He moved toward her, not with the measured, deliberate pacing of earlier in the evening, but with something more direct, less curated. Because I need you to understand that I am fully aware of what you did, and I need you to understand that it is causing me a significant problem. She held her ground. What kind of problem? He stopped close, closer than the calibrated 3 feet, closer than the elevator even, because the elevator had been physics, and this was choice, and they were both aware of the distinction. His eyes moved across her face with an attention that had stopped being analytical some rooms ago, and had become something that didn't have a tactical justification. The kind, he said very quietly, that doesn't resolve when the house is cleared. The de Gournay cranes held their painted silence on the wall outside the vault. Leo slept with his rabbit and his absolute certainty, and Sharon Fernandez stood in the warm, low light and looked at Daniel Ross looking at her, and understood that the wall she had maintained through silk and shadow and gunfire, and the particular devastating tenderness of a man cleaning her wound with a Mont Blanc travel kit. That wall had not survived the vault. It had not survived him on one knee on a Loro Piana blanket, touching his son's hair with his rings removed. Daniel, she said, his name in her mouth for the first time. She watched him register it. Yes, he said softly. Not an answer to anything she'd said, an answer to everything she hadn't. The sun came up over the Ross estate the way expensive things often did, without urgency, without apology, spreading itself across 162 rooms and the ground surrounding them with the calm authority of something that had always known it was welcome here. Sharon found her coat in the East Corridor where she had left it, folded over the arm of a Regency chair, as though she had intended, always, to retrieve it on the way out. She put it on over the torn cardigan and the ruined white dress, and she did not look at herself in the Venetian mirror above the hall table, because she had a precise understanding of what she would see, and she needed to be moving, not looking. And Delilah's agency bag was by the service door where she had left it the previous evening, a lifetime and 8 chapters ago. She picked it up. She walked the length of the East Hall, past the place on the Aubusson where the evening had begun its particular unraveling, past the closed library doors, past a war hall that watched her leave with the same flat, knowing attention it would bring to watching everything else, and she went down the stone steps and across the gravel drive in the early morning light toward the iron gate at the end of the approach, where the world outside the estate waited with its ordinary dimensions, and its complete ignorance of the night just concluded. The gate was open. She had checked from the window. It was standing open. Daniel was leaning against the left pillar. He had changed. A fresh shirt, the same dark trousers. His hair returned to its arrangement. He held 2 cups from what she recognized as the Aesop-appointed kitchen on the 3rd floor, the ones in the matte ceramic with the estate's initials, and he extended one toward her with the patient certainty of a man who had calculated that she would come this way and had arrived first and had brought coffee because he was, beneath everything, precisely that kind of man. She stopped, took the cup because her hands wanted something to do. "I called the agency," he said. She looked at him. "Delilah's position is secure. I've noted in the file that she performed exceptionally last night." A pause. "I did not specify the nature of the performance." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I also," he continued, without inflection, his eyes on hers over the rim of his cup, "called your agency." The morning air held still between them. "I withdrew the Ross estate from your next 3 campaign commitments, the Autumn Valentino booking, the Cartier retrospective, the Dubai editorial in November." He said it the way he said everything consequential, quietly, without theater, as though the demolition of her professional calendar was a minor administrative matter. They'll need replacements. I imagine they'll manage. She stared at him. You cannot simply... I've also spoken to the Salone's director about the Milan appearance in December. He tilted his head slightly. That one I left. I thought you'd want to keep it. Daniel. I don't want a nanny, he said, simply. Finally. The words landing with the same weight as the library door, the elevator's exhale, the click of the lock in the master suite at the beginning of all of this. I want the woman who learned my son's vault code and stayed anyway, who moved out from behind the Steinway when she didn't have to. His eyes stayed on hers. I want a partner, and I am prepared to be considerably more inconvenient than 3 canceled bookings until you decide you want the same. The iron gate stood open behind him. The gravel drive stretched between them and the road. The morning light moved across the face of the estate and made everything it touched look like it had always been permanent. Sharon looked at him over the rim of the ceramic cup, at the man who had cleaned her wound with a Mont Blanc kit and removed his rings to touch his son's hair and kissed her forehead like a declaration. And she thought about Delilah's yellow cardigan and the stuffed rabbit and 14 rooms and the way her name had sounded, returned to her, in the library's silver dark. She did not walk through the gate. The Milan appearance, she said. I'm keeping it. Of course, he said, and you're coming with me. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the thing that came before one, the structural decision that a smile had been approved and would arrive shortly. Yes, he said, I am.